So I'll start now with introducing you to Jane. Irvin and I met Jane Wilson, architect, during Green Doors Open Ottawa when we went to visit her passive house, which she sometimes refers to as base camp. And we were just over the moon. We were so impressed. We had a detailed tour, and I would highly recommend it if we're ever able to do this again sometime soon, of the house. It was fascinating. An architect is sort of a strange cat. It's a combination of art or aesthetics and engineering. And then to be a sustainable architect, on top of those two disciplines, you need to know something about the ecology. And then to be a very good architect, particularly of residential, you have to be able to listen really carefully, both to the site and to the people and the various stakeholders. And you'll hear about that. And Jane has an interesting website as well with other pictures. It's just under Jane Wilson Architect that you can take a look. And the thing that impressed me the most when I was going back over the website was her comments about the need to respect the site and optimize the interaction with the site. I think this is the kind of thinking we need when considering how we should develop our 7-acre site at Cleary. And especially since our original church, which we can't get into now, but was a leading edge church at the time. And we would like to continue to develop in such a way that it inspires Ottawa to develop consistent with climate change or climate action to ensure that there is a planet left for our grandchildren. So over to you, Jane. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'll share my screen here to start the presentation. And thank you, Susan. Yeah, it's for a couple of decades in being an architect. One of the things that has always really drawn me is trying to do a good job. And a good job for me means considering what happens when you build, both as you build and what happens afterwards. You know, are the people happy? You know, is it doing a good job for the environment? So really, when we're looking at sustainable building these days, there's a plethora of terms and codes and creeds to follow. And it becomes a very noisy conversation. So what I try to do in my work is figure out how to sort of get through all these words and do a good job in designing each project that I'm working on. So as you can see, I know that you've all, you know, are involved with the issues of climate change, and you've been reading, and there's a lot of terminology. I think perhaps one of the great things about all these terms is that they're all looking at the same targets. You know, there's many different ways proverbially to skin the cat. But the targets really are to have a healthy indoor and outdoor environments, you know, to manage our energy needs, you know, both in the materials that we're creating structures with and the use afterwards. So we do need to move away from the fossil fuel energy and to using more passive energy. You know, we have the sun, we have a lot of ways to promote a more passive energy. We need flexibility, because as we know, we're changing. The last few months has really brought that home, I think, to many of us, in the words that now we're on a Zoom meeting here. We probably wouldn't have thought of doing something like this even a few relatively few weeks ago. But what does that mean in terms of how our lives are going to change? So we need to take that into consideration. Too much building in the last 30 or 40 years has been done with thinking only immediately, assuming that buildings are going to be torn down and rebuilt in a couple of decades. That's not, in a word, sustainable. We can't keep rebuilding. So we have to build as well as we can and take into account that things are going to change over the future and we'll need to adapt. So really, to do that, it's really a matter of exploring the questions. So when I start any project, we're looking at what are the goals? What are we intending on doing? And equally, what are our limitations? You know, is there a budget? What's happening on the site that is going to limit what we build, how we build? Who is involved? You know, there's not a project when there's just one person involved. Often it is a group of people. And all projects have neighbors. So how are you connecting with your neighbors? Who is impacted in it? You know, if you build like some of the developments we have around Ottawa, traffic and everything else is impacted. What does the site say in terms of our region here particularly? We have incredible rivers. We have a lot of open country and farmland. How does that impact what we're doing? And most importantly, how does the project reflect our values? So we do need to think when we're doing it that we are doing something that is good for our society and for our environment. So as Susan said, I had the most wonderful opportunity in 2015 to move to Canada. I had been working in Pennsylvania. My daughter and my grandson are here in Ottawa. And so it was a great impetus to come to Canada. I'm a dual citizen, and it was the first time that I was moving to Canada. And I must say I'm extremely glad that we did. But when you're an architect and you design your own house, it has to truly reflect your values. You have to think about what you're doing and be able to put into the project all those things that you've been thinking about and really be able to take it to the limit of what you could. So when I was doing that and designing the house, I had to take inspiration from what I wanted. So for me, I wanted to build a house that was in line with the environment. I enjoy being outdoors. I enjoy traveling. I wanted to have that feeling of freedom in a relatively small space. And that is the inspiration that I brought to the project. You know, really asking that question, what is important? The first thing that's important to me is really the site. So the site where we are is 7 kilometers south of Manotick. On the left side of the plan here, the site plan, is the Rideau River. So we're very close to the floodplain. I have done a lot of designing when living in Pennsylvania in areas that were susceptible to flooding. So I both brought to it a certain amount of knowledge and also perhaps a certain amount of fear because I do know what can happen when a river is close by. So one of the first things that I did was actually to think of the site and how that impacted the design. It was a treed site. I decided we actually built up a bit where the actual house is. We didn't include a basement because if any of you live near a river, you understand that no matter how well you plan, sometimes water impacts you. I wanted to avoid that. But also in the design of the landscaping, I did as much as I could to make sure that we were recharging the water rather than creating water runoff and exacerbating the situation. So to do that, I've kept a compact house, have a very short driveway. So with keeping impervious surface to a minimum, to be able also, the green area here is eco lawn. So rather than having grass that's cut every week in the summer, we let it grow, and that way when we have rainfall, the water is absorbed into the site rather than running off into the river and into the creeks. Kept as many of the trees as possible, and this had a dual purpose on the south side of the house of being able to not only absorb some of the rainwater, but it also provides shading for the house and lessens the need for cooling in the summer. So when you're designing anything, you really have to think of what's actually happening around it and what you can use to help, first of all, to create an environment that you want to be in, and two, helps with the general environment in general. So. There are many different standards out there to build to these days. I chose for the house the passive house standard. What is it? Well, the terminology is it's a standard that allows for energy efficiency, a comfortable and ecological. It's not a particular type of construction, but a set of parameters that need to be met. So it puts standards on the amount of energy that you use to run the house and the amount of air that is circulating in the house. So we'll go through some of those on the next couple of slides. So this is an infrared images of typical houses. As you can see, where we have the red points, those are areas where heat is actually escaping from the house. So in a house that's built with wood studs, If you just have the wood studs, no matter how much insulation you put through the wood studs, the heat actually escapes out through the wood. And so you can see here with the different lines, those are the studs in the house that are sucking the heat out of a house. You know, and the areas that are often very vulnerable, of course, are around windows, because you have a hole in the wall. And if you don't seal around the windows well enough, you know, the heat just walks out the door. So when you look at these images, it really can be very frightening and but very interesting at the same time. So it really gives you a roadmap of what you have to do when you're building the house to avoid that. So one of the most important things is insulation. Not only, as I said before, not only the amount of insulation, but how it's put into the house. So first of all, we have the insulation underneath the ground. You know, there is a lot of thermal action that comes up through the ground. So I actually have, under our house here, I have 8 inches of foam insulation. So an R40, which is almost twice as much as the code is for the walls of a house currently. On the walls, I have an R60 insulation. And what it is, we've put it both in between the studs, typically normal, but also wrapping the house and getting a continuous insulation around the house. And this provides a thermal break that doesn't allow the heat to escape out of the house. One of the most important things, of course, is good windows. And unfortunately, windows are, if you're building anything, windows are one of the big expenditures. But they're an expenditure that really gives a payback. A good window, which you know, has good glazing on it and also is well insulated, can really make a difference. I mean, we've all been in houses where in the winter, if you sit next to a window, you get pretty cold because the window is transmitting the cold from outside. Not to mention sometimes you feel a breeze, which is what happens when the window isn't secured very, very well. And that gets to the next point, the airtightness. In passive house, a lot of time is spent in designing it so the building envelope is totally, as much as possible, airtight. And you use what's called a blower door test to test that airtightness at the end of construction. This allows you to when you create energy in the house, to keep it within the house. It also, like what happened last week, is it keeps that heat from outside the house from coming inside the house. So you benefit both in all seasons. Another way to have really good low energy use is through the lighting. You know, we live in a climate where, okay, in the summer, the lighting's not bad. We get plenty of sunshine. But in the winter, it's really dark. So when I go through and design something, you look in the house and where do you need to have windows? You know, what tasks are you performing in what rooms? And how can you use the natural light from outside to light it up? During the winter, really from 8 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon, or in December till 4:30 or so, we don't have any lights on in the house because we don't need them. And so both my husband and I work from home, and we position work so that our offices are well lit, and the rooms that we work in and move around are also well lit naturally through daylighting. The big advantage in the last 5 years is the cost of LED lighting. It now is as affordable as any lighting out there. And we have a variety of lighting. Works very well. For the low energy use, you need to have efficient appliances. You know, I think we all know that. You know, there's nothing worse for your pocketbook than an old furnace, which really uses a lot of energy. But that goes the same for refrigerators and washers and dryers. So having energy efficient appliances really helps on the energy consumption. Because our house is so well insulated and so well and has good air tightness, all our heating is done, if you see here in the red circle, by 2 of these little mini splits. So if you've traveled to the Caribbean or something, you know, those are those little units that they have, and it's a tiny little unit. It's very efficient, but due to using the heat from the sun on our south-facing windows, so you can see here, this is the percentage of window area in each wall, and most of it is on the south side. So that's where we get a lot of the heat in the winter, and the shade of the trees and the shade of the roof awnings allows us not to have the heat come in the summer. But that's all in the designing with the sun. So we just have these 2 little units. In the evening, we have a tiny wood stove, which is especially built for passive houses. So rather than using the air from inside the house, it actually draws air from the outside, so you're not losing any of that heat like you do with a fireplace. And then the other part of our mechanical system is a very small HRV, which circulates and filters the air. So one of the key, one of the main losses of energy from a house in the winter, particularly here, is when you turn on that bathroom exhaust fan, because what happens there is all that heat is sucked out of the house. In a passive house system, rather than going out to the exterior, that the air is drawn out or filtered from your bathrooms or from your kitchen and taken up and filtered and then recirculated. And it's actually mixed with a little bit of fresh air. So you get that continual little bit of fresh air that you need. It makes for a very nice environment to live in, particularly for people like myself. I suffer a bit from allergies in the spring, but I come home and that filtered air is very refreshing. Okay, one of the things that I wanted to include in the house was really realizing that being where we are, you know, using materials that are native to us. And if there's one thing that we have, are trees. So I did use a lot of wood, avoiding having, well, I can't really think of anything where I had any harmful chemicals in what we put into the house. You know, it's, you know, there are a lot of hidden chemicals in different building products and stuff like that. But now we've come to the point where we really can design and build with a nice interior environment. One other thing that I did a lot of was recycling. So some of the, let's say, supplementary building materials, I made into furniture. So on the left here is a part of the wood beam we had was left over. It makes a perfect side table. And also use some of the wood from construction of making some tables. Not for everybody to do, but I really did enjoy doing it. One of the things about when you're thinking about the future of the place, we never know what's going to happen. I have clients who, let's say if they're in their 40s and they're worried about how their kids are doing in school, they never think about what could happen. You know, they're talking about building their forever house. And in some cases, they think of themselves as, you know, invincible. But I do put into every design that aspect of what if. You know, you don't have to be 90 years old to need to be and have a crutch, to have a wheelchair. Accidents happen, you know, and so building or designing so that you can move around, so that in our house, everything we need is essentially on the ground floor, and we can access easily from the exterior. We can move. We have plenty of space in the bathroom. Should we in the future need to work with move with a wheelchair or a walker or something? And I think this is important. You know, we need to have accessibility at all phases of life. So really in future thinking, you know, low maintenance materials, you know, so often, you know, a house or a building looks really nice the first couple of years. Then things start to creak and become less beautiful. So really thinking ahead, very few people want to spend their weekends anymore repairing their house. So, you know, keeping that in our house, the majority of the siding is corrugated metal. I don't believe that I'm going to have to do anything with that. Maybe my grandson might have to, and he inhabits the house, but I don't intend on. I do like wood, so I put a little bit of wood at the front entrance in a protective alcove, just to give a warmer feeling for coming into the house.
Jane, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, great. I'll move on then. Okay, so age in place, we talked about, low operating costs, and easy site maintenance. We are not in an environment where we can't think about snow and snow removal. A few words about the urban environment. I think I don't have time to go into depth on that, but the idea that when I was working in Manotick, so relatively open environment. When you're working on a project in an urban environment, all those questions become much greater. You really have to think more. They become bigger, and they involve more stakeholders. A couple of things for the urban environment is the heat island effect and stormwater management are very important. So a heat island effect, the more built environment you have, the more the temperatures rise due to not having a way to mitigate it. Okay. Managing water, both from rainstorms and the snow, is one of our biggest challenges here in our climate. And it really has to be thought of in any project. Existing buildings, these are complex to update. You have to consider the outside, the historical value, the structure. You're never quite sure what has been done over the years. Inside, what materials are no longer used or considered safe. Asbestos, of course, was one of the key ones of those, but some of the building materials in the late 20th century were not the healthiest. And to achieve a current good energy standard, you really need to do careful analysis and careful planning. And of course, dealing with the unexpected costs can explode when renovating buildings. But nothing is more sustainable or more satisfying than breathing a new life into an older building. You know, our Ottawa is built up of a number of buildings that reflect us, reflect our history, and maintaining this feel is very important. The final thoughts, last slide. You know, when you're looking towards sustainable building, understand the goals that you're trying to achieve, know what your budget is, you know, make sure that you can analyze and compare the different options, does a lot of analytical work, and make the best choices you can to move towards a zero carbon future. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. How do I get out of here?
Stop sharing the screen.
There, thank goodness.
Oops.
Yeah, okay, hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Oh,
I can.
thank you so much, Jane. That was fabulous. And we have lots of questions. So I'll start with just a few. Maybe
Okay.
I'll start at the end. You were mentioning the difficulties of an urban environment, and I'm wondering if you could just say anything you might think of relating to our 7-acre location, which is on an NCC border and near the Ottawa River ecologically, and also a transit-oriented stop and Richmond Road. And yes, okay, I know it's a puzzle we've been struggling with. And of course, the height is a little bit, changes a little bit as it goes from Richmond Road toward the water. As does the intensity of the possible building, according to the zoning. So I know that's sort of unfair because you haven't had a chance due to COVID to actually go and walk the site. I know that's unfair.
Yeah.
And so I'm just asking for sort of a brainstorm if you can think of anything. The heat island is certainly relevant, and we did have some options presented to us that had a lot of cement and not so much green. But so we're trying to figure out what a compromise would be.
Yeah, I think that, you know, first of all, like I said, for me, that managing the water is really Well, it was our 20th century challenge, and we didn't do a good job. So we do have to do a much better job in the 21st century. So it comes in two forms. Well, three forms really. One is the incredible storm events that can happen, and because we labeled something global warming, we made a mistake. It really is global weirding or global storming. And it really is the kind of thing where you have to expect the unexpected. You have to be able to, when you're doing a building, you have to be able to protect that building in the way. So part of that is building a good building. Too many buildings that we saw in the tornado a couple of years ago, maybe if they had been built a little bit differently, they would have survived. Second, Ottawa is a city of rivers, and being so close to a major river like Ottawa is something to take into consideration. So you have to build, can you lift the building up in some way that if there is a flood there, that you can't stop everything, but you can minimize the damage that could happen to a building. That's a number of different techniques. And like you said, minimizing the concrete, minimizing the impervious surface is very important. And third and final, we get a lot of snow. Some of the issues that we have in Ottawa is the fact that we have many places where we don't know where the snow goes in the winter. Well, if we get a spring, and it's a matter of what happens, you can get phenomenal melting all at once. So all those things have to be taken into point. What happens with water in its various forms when it comes towards the site? And what can you do to alleviate some of that problem for your site and for the sites around you? And secondly, what do you do to protect the buildings in any event?
Thank you.
It's a big question.
It is a big question, and you did really well. Well, I'll go to the slightly more specific question. One of the things we are thinking about building, at least, is some social housing or some affordable housing. Mm-hmm. And if we built that affordable housing on our western boundary, it's contiguous with our neighbors, which you mentioned earlier. And so the maximum would be 4 stories. But I guess the question is, can we build connected or some kind of affordable housing to be net zero carbon? There are always problems of cost as well. Mm-hmm. So we will have them there on our site for a long time. So we do want them to be good buildings that do stay up and do not cost a fortune to operate, as well as a building that is net zero. So any advice or thoughts you might have on that?
Yeah, certainly. The lifespan of a building is always important. So you have initial costs, and when you're looking at multi-unit or multi-family buildings, certainly that's a better cost point for building well. You have fewer walls, and the walls are the things that add the cost. So you're starting from a good point. And also when you look at, you have to balance initial costs and what happens in terms of, let's say, 10 years in operating costs. And, putting those two things into the calculation allows you to give your budget for the construction. Mm-hmm. So, you don't do some weird building with, wings flying out or whatever. You know, it's better to have a bit of a traditional shape to a building. I don't say traditional style. I think style is a whole different thing. But you need to not have a lot of peculiarities to the building. That reduces the cost. That being said, like I said, a multi-unit building is more efficient to build sustainably than single units.
Thank you.
And it's the
What if-
long-term operating costs that really pushes the envelope on that. So.
It really does. Thank you so much. And one of, yes?
Mentioned, there are 3 questions that have come to me, I think, instead of you, so I just want to make you aware of that. That I have 3 more questions that I don't think you've seen.
Would you like to ask one of them now?
Sure. I'll ask the first one because I think it's somewhat related to what Jane just addressed. The question was, could she speak about the economics of passive housing? Does the energy saving pay for the extra cost of building to a higher standard, or to what extent does it pay for the extra cost?
Yeah, I think it definitely does. But I can only say that there's so much more that goes into the cost of a building. So all projects, I have never had a project where you don't have to think about a budget. So, you know, sometimes that wish list that you have within a building has to be managed and made effective. So that's part of my job, is in going through a process with my clients, I've got to keep track and say, well, I know that's what, you know, you want, but look at this alternative. This can be as effective, but will cost less. So right from the beginning, you do have to keep an eye on the cost in any building. Yeah, so, but yeah, I do believe that building efficiently really is, if you're looking at 10 years or 20 years, 30 or 40 years out, you know, you really start to see the difference.
Thank you. And here's another question, which I know you had this difficulty as well. Someone is asking about having to import high quality windows and appliances and stuff from Europe, for example, who is a bit ahead of us on these things. And how are you finding the evolution of North American suppliers?
Well, that's one of the greatest news in the last 5 years. And unfortunately, that's about the timeline when I built my house. So if I were building my house today, I would be building with Canadian or North American windows. I couldn't do that 5 years ago, and believe me, I tried. I canvassed everyone who said they were doing good quality windows in all of North America. And I couldn't get anything that was anywhere near my price point. But now we've done incredible things in the last 5 years. So now the projects I'm working on, the windows are coming from Canada. And I'm really, really happy about that.
Thank you. There's also some concern about COVID implications, and I'll combine a few questions here. But so someone is worried about the long grass because of the ticks.
Mm-hmm.
And how are you dealing with that at your location? What would you recommend? Some people are worried about cleanliness, like some architectural places recommend more sinks near the door or something like that. And what was there? Was one more other one. Anyway, if you have anything to say about our current implications for COVID, that would be lovely.
Yeah, it's always great when I hate to say it like this, but it's great when you go through a crisis because it forces you to learn and to rethink. And that's, you know, that's a wonderful opportunity that you shouldn't be missed. And if I address the ticks first, yeah, I think the ticks are all around us. if I must be clear, you know, I don't spend too much time throwing a baseball out in my lawn. You know, if I had tiny little children, I might have a different play space for them. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't use the same approach that I have for the majority of the area. So yes, I think ticks are everywhere. So we do have to be careful. But most of us, if you drive and you look at people's lawns, and then you sort of analyze how many people are out on their lawns, I would say that 99.5% of the people are actually mowing the lawns. So they're probably closer to the ticks than I ever get. So yeah, just a personal thing. For the COVID, obviously, you know, when you travel to some other cultures, they already had things like washing stations when you came inside the house and whatnot. And yeah, I think you know, we tend to have a powder room at an entrance, so we've probably already done that a bit. But the idea of that entrance into a house or a building where you take off your shoes and you wash your hands, yes, I think that's beautiful, and maybe maybe the COVID will allow us to almost formalize that in a way, or make that a little bit of more of a ritual. Those of you who have been to my house know that I have a real bugaboo with Canadian foyers. You know, they're small, they're tight, there's cluttered with lots of shoes and different things. So, you know, I don't think that we make enough of what happens when you enter a house. You know, we need to leave, you know, the outside, the hustle and bustle of the world, and come into our home. And the COVID, I think one thing that has been mentioned with that was in larger buildings, particularly, they were talking about circulating air and how that might be a problem with COVID and being able to circulate the virus. But I think, yes, that put an emphasis on circulating air becoming more filtered and more attention paid to the filtering devices that we put in that air circulation. And that in itself could actually help the situation, because the circulating air would be filtered and not hanging ready to land on us.
Great, thank you. There's also a series of questions about apartment buildings, for higher buildings, and questions such as, is there a maximum height that you find efficient? Or, for example, Codco was telling us that they preferred to build in wood and they didn't want it to be really high rise. Some people prefer that we have a high rise to earn money to be able to do the affordable housing. Another issue besides height is green space for residents. Is there any way we can organize that they have green space? Some people talk about green roofs, and I know that they are a little bit of a problem in our climate, better in warm climates, but is there some way we can deal with green space for people in a high rise? And also other people are talking about elevators. Is there things we need to know about elevators, and whether a high rise building is more expensive?
Yeah, and another small question, right? But,
sorry.
But yeah, I think you going through that analysis and understanding what's best on the site is very important, and that really, you know, what's best and what is actually allowed on the site is important. You don't want to, you want to be a neighborhood, a good neighbor, you know, so that figures into it. In terms of a wood building, I can't remember, but now I think that they have built wood buildings to as high as we would be able to build in Ottawa anyway. So that I don't think is a real stickling point. You know, I think that the idea of making a safe building in a higher building is important, you know, to be able to, you know, make sure that people feel safe and feel somewhat connected to nature and feel comfortable is important. Elevators are a necessity in many circumstances. And I won't say I have nothing against elevators, because personally they're not my favorite means of transportation, but you know, they are needed in any building, really over 2 stories. Any building needs to have an elevator. You know, you want to make sure that you're not blocking people from accessing a building. You know, do they add costs to a building? Yes. Does the height of a building help to contain some costs? Yes, in a lot of ways. It's a bit of a Rubik's Cube of parameters that you have to go through. It's one of the fun parts of a project, really. it is putting all those things together and sort of figuring out what is that perfect way to go.
Maury, did you want to ask another question? Thank you, Jane.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Susan. The other question that came to me, because one of them was already answered, or 2 of them have been answered. What kind of window design did you use, Jane, in your house, and what advice would you provide generally about window design?
Well, what I do is I use what I know about sun and daylighting and whatever, and I start the design process. And during the design, I use my design software allows me to say, well, on the 21st of December at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, where's the sun? And on the 5th of June at 10 o'clock in the morning, where's the sun? So I take that around and I look at the shadows and the light coming in, and take that through. That takes some time to get it right, you know. And in a larger building, it takes more time, because particularly if you have a high building, it's different what's on the first floor and what's on the upper floors. If you have a lot of trees, it's different in the summer and the winter. Again, it goes into that package of analyzing the data. Now, of course, ideally in a passive house, you say, yes, you have a southern exposure with lots of windows and shadings for those times when you have summer heat or summer sunshine. But you never have a perfect site. You know, you never have a perfect orientation. So you do have to figure out what is best. You know, it'd be great if every site had a beautiful exposure to the south and not only sun, but a view. But sometimes to the south of you, the last thing you want to be doing is looking out the windows. You know, so if you're looking at another brick wall, you're not getting much benefit from it. So going through that analysis during the process is extremely important.
There are some questions also about designing for handicapped clients. So I guess they're asking about things such as space. And there's also a similar question about mental health access to green space. Good, if you could take a look at that, that would be great.
Yeah, first of all, people with disabilities have to be considered. And I think, like I said before, we never know when that's going to happen to us or to our loved ones. You know, you can't count on the future. So, you know, I I want that to be in every project. It doesn't have to be a billboard that says this is an accessible place. It just has to be made so that you have the space. Now, there's some places where it might be advantage to tighten up the space a little bit. So what I often do in that is maybe make something that could be removed. You know, so that if you have a wall that could be removed, that would easily give a good accessible access to a bathroom, that can work too. So again, thinking if it's something that you know in the future might be a possibility, make it so that you're not constraining so it can't be a possibility. You know, and that's sort of a juggling on. You know, so size of doors and things like that. You know, if you suddenly find yourself, you're in a car accident, you break 2 legs, you don't want to have to take apart your door. You know, we can make doorways wide enough. You know, very few circumstances where we can't make a doorway wide enough for people to use. So it's a matter of using common sense in that. And I forget the second part of the
Access to green space, is there?
yeah.
How?
I think all of us are mentally better off when we have access to green space. You know, and sometimes that can be white space. One of the design elements I put into the house was to give, I love the winter views that we have. You know, being able to look out at nature and see something is something that's very special to me. So having the views, if you're doing a multi-unit place, you know, public space is very important, but also private natural space is important. You know, not everybody wants to sit outside and anybody walking by can say, "Hi, how are you? What are you doing?" You know, some of us, you know, want to be able to sit outside and just think or to read. And so that balance of public and private spaces within a natural environment, I think is also very, very important to put into a project, particularly people who are vulnerable, because, you know, they go through different phases of how they react with the outside world. And so if you can give them the opportunity to feel comfortable during those different phases, that also is something that's very, very positive.
Great, thank
Not
you.
always easily done, mind you, but
Yeah.
a very positive goal to look at. Yeah.
I have
Laura.
one more question, Maury, if we think we can do a quick one.
Well, I've got one more too. So I think we need to do formal closing here so that people will feel comfortable leaving if they need to. And then we can continue the discussion for another 15 to 20 minutes and handle those other questions. But
Okay.
once you're closing, Susan, I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Jane. As you can tell from the questions, there was a huge amount of interest, and you've really given us a lot to think about. I'm particularly, that last one about private and public space, I thought a green space was very an interesting thing, and your whole presentation has been excellent, and I recommend to people to take a look at your website if you want some more information. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.